In the early years of a brand new millennium, just as the world was looking ahead to the future, it had to stop and welcome its very first new country. That was the year 2002. A brand new flag was raised, a new national anthem was sung for the very first time. But, this was no peaceful, quiet transition. This was a nation literally born from fire and ashes. So you have to ask yourself, how did this tiny, half-island nation manage to endure centuries of being ignored, followed by a quarter-century of brutal occupation, to finally claim its place on the world stage? This is the incredible story of Timor-Leste, a nation forged in a fight for its very soul against absolutely unimaginable odds. All right, let's get into it. Our story kicks off on an island filled with these dramatic, rugged mountains and ancient traditions. An island whose borders, well, they weren't drawn by nature, but by competing colonial powers. So picture this. We're in Southeast Asia, Timor-Leste. It takes up the eastern half of Timor Island. And its landscape? It's just dominated by these volcanic mountain ridges, so incredibly steep that almost half the country is sitting on a slope. It really is a land of extremes, right? You've got the rough Banda Sea to the north and the much calmer Timor Sea down south. Even the country's name tells a piece of its story. Timor comes from the Malay word for east, and leste is the Portuguese word for, you guessed it, east. So the nation is literally called East-East. It's this strange little linguistic quirk, a kind of echo of the two different cultures that would shape its destiny. Long before any European ships ever sailed into view, this island was already on the map. Why? Because of one precious resource, fragrant sandalwood. That smell, that wood, it pulled the island right into the vast trading networks of Asia. Then the Portuguese arrived. They planted their flag and claimed the territory, but their rule was, well, distant to say the least. For 400 years, East Timor was basically an afterthought for them, just a neglected trading post. They barely invested anything, which meant the Timorese people and their own complex cultures were mostly just left alone. But then came 1975, and that long, almost quiet period of neglect was about to explode into a period of just unimaginable violence. A real darkness was about to fall over the island. So what happened? Well, a revolution way back in Portugal suddenly ripped its colonial empire apart. And here, that created a massive power vacuum. A short, really bitter civil war broke out, and the Fretilin Party declared independence. For a moment, the Timorese people had their freedom, but it lasted for exactly 9 days, because on December 7th, their neighbor Indonesia launched a massive, full-scale invasion. Indonesia just annexed the territory. They called it their 27th province. It was an occupation that the United Nations never, ever recognized. But this was the Cold War, right? In the grand scheme of global politics, the struggle of one tiny nation was, sadly, very easy for the world to ignore. For the people of Timor-Leste, this was the beginning of 24 years of absolute darkness. And the human cost, it's just staggering. It's hard to even wrap your head around. A major report, a really detailed one, documented a minimum of over 100,000 deaths. And these weren't just battlefield casualties. We're talking about killings, forced hunger, and disease, all directly tied to the conflict. And, some estimates put the total loss of life even higher than that, maybe as high as 200,000 people. Just pause and think about that for a second. That's nearly 1/3 of the entire population before the invasion, wiped out. And yet, through all that suffering, a small guerrilla resistance, led by that same Fretilin Party, just kept fighting. They held out in the rugged mountain interior. They became more than just soldiers, you see. They were the keepers of the flame, the very idea of a Timorese identity. They were a living symbol that Timor-Leste refused, absolutely refused, to be extinguished. So for decades, this fight, this suffering, it all happened pretty much in silence. The world wasn't watching. But then, a single tragic event captured on camera would change everything. It would finally force the world to look. The turning point was 1991. The place? The Santa Cruz Cemetery. Indonesian soldiers opened fire on a crowd of peaceful, pro-independence protesters. But this time was different. This time, journalists were there. And they managed to smuggle footage of the massacre out of the country. For the very first time, the world could see with its own eyes the raw brutality of the occupation, and suddenly the international pressure on Indonesia became, well, it became impossible to ignore. So, fast forward 8 years to 1999. The people of East Timor were finally given a choice. The UN sponsored a referendum on independence. And the result? An overwhelming 78.5% voted for freedom. But that choice was met with one last terrifying backlash. Pro-Indonesian militias unleashed a final, brutal campaign of violence, until at last, an international peacekeeping force arrived to restore order. And so, on May 20th, 2002, the flag of an independent Timor-Leste was raised, this time for good. The long, brutal fight for survival was finally over. But, a new struggle was just beginning. This was the struggle to actually build a nation from scratch, to turn the dream of freedom into a real, functioning country. Okay, so every new nation needs an economy, right? And Timor-Leste found its lifeline deep under the sea, offshore oil and gas. This stuff basically became the bedrock of the entire state. I mean, think about this. Today, a whopping 80% of the government's budget comes from its National Petroleum Fund. And this creates a huge contradiction, a really stark contrast. On one hand, you have this immense natural resource wealth. We're talking a sovereign wealth fund worth $19 billion back in 2021. But on the other hand, the reality for the people on the ground is completely different. Over 40% of the population lives in poverty. It's the classic textbook case of the resource curse, where all that money just doesn't seem to trickle down. And here's another thing. Timor-Leste is one of the youngest countries on the planet. And I don't just mean politically, I mean its people. Roughly 60% of the entire population is under the age of 24. That is a massive generation born into freedom, a generation that has no direct memory of the occupation. And all of this leads to the final, absolutely critical question. That oil and gas money that built the modern state, it's not going to last forever. In fact, it's projected to run out. So can this new generation, the kids who inherited the peace won by a brutal struggle they never had to live through, can they take that legacy of incredible resilience and transform it into a sustainable future? The answer to that question, well, it's going to write the next chapter for the first new nation of the 21st century.